Welcome to This Week in Prophecy with James Jacob Prash, presented by Mori LTV.
Live to you this week from Galilee, Israel. Jacob.
Baruchim habayim mi-Israel. Greetings and blessings in Jesus from Israel. B'Shem HaMashiach Yeshua Adonenu. Coming to you, of course, as Joshua pointed out, this week in prophecy from Israel, where so much prophecy is generated and world events are examined in light of the Word of God. This week in prophecy, though, we begin not in Israel, but rather in Great Britain. Very interesting developments. Boris Johnson, the lead contender for the next office of Prime Minister in the UK and leader of the Conservative Party, replacing Theresa May, has described himself as a quote-unquote passionate Zionist, a passionate Zionist. He connected this with charges of Iranian malbehavior and Iranian violation of earlier agreements concerning nuclear enrichment. He has said that he is distancing himself effectively from some of his criticisms of Israel in 2014, where, as mayor of London, he remarked that Israel's response to the aggression of Hamas was disproportionately high. This time, he describes himself as a passionate Zionist and Israel as a great country whom he loves. This may be, of course, politically motivated, in part for the next election. The anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that is overtaking most of the Labour Party is forcing traditional left-wing Jewish voters to reconsider their position, with a prospect of a Jeremy Corbyn, no friend of Israel, and most would say no friend of the Jews, leading the Labour Party, and as a potential prime minister should Labour win. He may be courting the Jewish vote away from the Labour Party, which involves, of course, financial support from the Jewish business and professional community. In any event, Boris Johnson, a native New Yorker, like Donald Trump, describes himself this week in prophecy as a passionate Zionist. This would be a major shift in a British government towards a stronger position in favor of Israel. Historically, Britain has always been at best ambiguous, with a slight exception of Margaret Thatcher. This will be a very pro Zionist government under Boris Johnson, should he become the prime minister. And as we've said in the past, it would be interesting to have a president of the United States and a prime minister of Great Britain, both of them native New Yorkers, this week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Council's commander has described Iran as a regional power, a major regional power, due to its ability to have shot down an unarmed, unmanned American reconnaissance drone. The Trump administration declined to respond with a counterattack militarily, but instead launched cyber attacks and further economic sanctions against Iran, which arguably may damage Iran more than certain airstrikes would. This battle continues. As we've said, while there has not yet been armed conflict with the United States and Iran directly in the Persian Gulf, there has certainly been armed conflict between the United States and Iranian forces in Syria, and a cyber attack by the NSA and American intelligence community, certainly with the participation of Israel and possibly the British GCHQ, which in the Middle East operates out of Cyprus, is underway. But let's continue looking this week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, in the Middle East, the United States has urged Turkey to cease its drilling for oil and natural gas off the coast of Cyprus. This echoes the similar warnings from the European Union that it would have economic consequences on Turkey at the behest of Greece. The minority Turkish community of the Turkish Cypriots and the majority Greek Turkish community had a history of peaceful coexistence dating back to the time when Cyprus was a British colony. But a falling out began to take place in the 1970s with aggressive military action by the Turkish government and Turkish nationalist regimes. That has divided Cyprus, with Turkey seeing the Cypriot portion of Cyprus as part of Greater Turkey effectively, and somehow counting itself as worthy of an entitlement to potential natural resources. These oil and gas fields would be almost an extension of the Leviathan fields off the coast of Israel, extending towards Cyprus, that is being argued for by Lebanon and Syria. Now Turkey has become a player in what may be the largest oil field in the Western Hemisphere outside of the United States. This is entirely possible with the depletion of North Sea oil. Nonetheless, let's continue to watch. Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Cyprus, Greece, Turkey, the EU are all becoming players in the economic, political, and strategic scenario surrounding oil and natural gas in the Levant in the Eastern Mediterranean. This week in prophecy, these issues will be of prophetic significance. This week in prophecy, the British ambassador to the United States, Sir Kim Derach, resigned after calling President Trump incompetent and saying that his administration was dysfunctional. He said this despite American gains economically that has seen an amount of growth that is in many respects almost unprecedented, as well as improvements in America's international trade position and a rebuilding of America's military infrastructure. Obviously, he has some kind of left-wing and, more specifically, almost certainly pro-European sentiments. What really underlies this resignation and these criticisms is the division within the British Conservative Party over those who are pro-Brexit, following Boris Johnson, and those who are pro-Remain, the Conservative Party establishment of Theresa May and co. Once more, the United States has become a player in Britain's policies concerning Brexit. Donald Trump announced that he gave solid advice to Theresa May as to how to handle Brexit negotiations with the European Union that continually broke down. She has rejected that advice, according to Mr. Trump, and has gone her quote-unquote own stupid way. Plainly, Mr. Trump's sentiments lie with Brexit, as we've always known, with Boris Johnson, at least at the moment, and certainly with Nigel Farage. He has never been a friend of Theresa May, and she has never been a friend of his. The nature and importance of the special relationship may have kept open confrontation at bay, but underneath was a sheath of political hostility that is now coming to a climax as Theresa May prepares to leave office, having failed in her mandate to implement Brexit. This week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, the United States has for the first time sanctioned members of the Lebanese parliament, 2 members of Hezbollah. The European Union and most European countries draw or have drawn a distinction between Hezbollah as a political organization and Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Mr. Pompeo, the American Secretary of State, made it clear the United States does not. And this week, Amin Shetty and Mohammed Hassan Ra'ad were both sanctioned by the American government. This has a certainly symbolic importance. Hezbollah being an agent and a almost strategic fiduciary of Iranian interests in Lebanon. If there is a conflict between Israel and Iran, it's almost unthinkable that Hezbollah and southern Lebanon would not be a major player. This week in prophecy. the posturing continues. This week in prophecy, Hamas has conducted military exercises in visible sight of the Israeli side of the border fence in Gaza, completely observable. It would make no strategic sense to carry out military maneuvers where your potential opponent can observe them. It was obviously a display made for internal consumption by the people of Gaza. It is not likely to do anything to intimidate Israel. But it does show that the posturing continues, not only in Lebanon and in Syria, not only in the Persian Gulf, but in Gaza. It is not unthinkable that all four of these areas could be implemented in a coming conflict that would be proxy wars between Israel and Iran, in which the United States and other powers could become players. This week in prophecy, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Rosh HaMemshalah, the prime minister, visited an Israeli air base in the Negev, where the majority of Israel's F-35s are based. They have advanced American avionics packages and Israeli modifications. Mr. Netanyahu said these planes can reach and hit Iran from inside of Israel and easily fly over countries in between the two, nearly undetected. Not only that, but it is likely that these countries who are Sunni, lying on the west side of the Persian Gulf, would allow the Israelis to fly over to attack Iranian targets. The precedent for this was set many years ago when Saudi Arabian AWACS planes with American advisory crews in the cockpits flew to the south of Saudi Arabia to allow Israeli F-15s and F-16s to attack Saddam Hussein's nuclear reactor in Iraq. These countries have more than once moved out of the way and let Israel have access to their airspace for the purpose of attacking other Islamic countries that they saw as a threat to them. This could very easily happen again. Meanwhile, this week in prophecy, however, the Pentagon has announced it for next year of 2020, and the present budget, it is looking to purchase fewer F-35s in order to purchase within the budget more modified, upgraded F-15s. Modifications of the F-15 and F-18 have had significant impact on the performance ability of those aircraft avionically, and a fraction of the cost of the F-35. It has become a budgetary issue. F-35 acquisitions will continue at a lower pace, at least for the next year to year and a half. This week in prophecy, Europe is again shaken financially and economically, with Deutsche Bank, the largest bank in continental Europe, announcing 18,000 job layoffs internationally. It has gotten itself into serious financial and economic problems. The equivalent of what happened to Northern Rock in Britain with the subprime lending crisis. It is that serious and on that scale potentially. A collapse of Deutsche Bank would create some kind of a banking panic within the European Union that would have global ramifications, certainly even for a post-Brexit British banking establishment and industry based in London and for Wall Street. Deutsche Bank is battling to improve its position, but many think it is actually battling for its long-term survival and preservation. It will have immense ramifications if Deutsche Bank fails to reorganize itself and to make some kind of a comeback to the position it had. Its liabilities have become massive. Its efficiency has become low. And now the cuts are coming this week in prophecy. We are told in the book of Daniel that It is the Lord who establishes kings and removes kings. Whatever the outcome of the next American presidential election, it'll ultimately be the sovereign hand of God that determines this. But God does work through the practical circumstances of political reality, of social reality, of strategic and economic reality. Left-wing New York billionaire, vehement opponent of Donald Trump, Tom Steyer, has become the next liberal, ultra-liberal Democrat to enter the presidential race. The Democratic playing field of prospective candidates has become saturated to the point of almost being ridiculous. But now, those numbers are not only swelling, but the members are beginning to turn against each other. Their hatred of Donald Trump, or their common desire to win the next election away from Mr. Trump, is not preserving any sense of party unity. It is not the main issue. The main issue is, by virtual inheritance, as a former vice president and long-standing figure in Washington, and as a centrist, Joe Biden, vice president of Barack Obama, was the front-runner, having over 40% of the support within the Democratic Party. That has now dissipated to well under 30%, probably in the mid-20s. By some accounts, he may not even be the front-runner. What is haunting him now is his pre-Obama voting record in the U.S. Senate as a senator from Delaware, when he voted against certain kinds of civil rights legislation to appease the old Dixiecrat or boll weevil Democrats in the U.S. Senate who'd been segregationist from the time of Jim Crow. The Democratic Party has bent over backwards to try to erase its history as the party of slavery and the party of Jim Crow and segregation. But this week in prophecy, it is not working. Their leading candidate in this very crowded playing field is now under attack from within his own party. The Lord will establish the next president, and it thus far does not look like there's anyone viable in unseating Donald Trump democratically. Confusion in their ranks. Let us continue. This week in prophecy, the House of Representatives proposed a defense budget that is inadequate and unsatisfactory to President Trump and his administration. Essentially, there is a $17 billion reduction in research and development and upgrading allocations for the dilapidated weapon systems that Mr. Trump inherited. These upgradings are taking place quickly, and they are creating jobs, mainly within the United States. Mr. Trump sees this defense spending as something that should help the overall economy and domestic manufacturing. But it is $17 billion short of what he requested. Additionally, there is a denial of the amount of funding he wanted to involve the Pentagon in border security, which is entirely constitutional. It is, according to the Constitution, the responsibility of the president to protect the borders, and there is no real legal or constitutional argument that would prevent him from doing it in principle. The Democrats have used left-wing agenda as judges to try to find other reasons, saying you need congressional approval to do it. It is a political battle now more than a legal one, and it's taking place this week in prophecy. Mr. Trump is the populist president. He was not, however, the founder of populism. The populism was H. Ross Perot, who this week died of leukemia after a 5-month battle. He was a computer and software entrepreneur, known as a patriot, but he was the harbinger, the founder of the populism that eventually saw the election of Donald Trump. He is also accredited by most political commentators and by the Bush dynasty as being responsible for the electoral defeat of George Bush Sr., an establishment Republican who was owned and operated by the Saudi Arabians in the opinion of many people, as was his son. The Bush dynasty, of course, was establishment Republican from the word go. It was never conservative and has been at the center of multiple scandals, from Enron to the SNL catastrophe to the Contragate scandal. Bush has always been the name associated with such corruption. But now, the man who saved the country from a re-election of Bush, but in the opinion of many, helped elect Bill Clinton instead by dividing the conservative vote, has left us. His final act, however, was writing a campaign contribution check for the re-election of Donald Trump. This week in prophecy also, the Jewish American entrepreneur of Home Depot fame, Bernie Marcus, has announced his support for Donald Trump, with left-wing groups calling for a boycott of his businesses, his stores, of the company of which he chairs. Home Depot is a very successful company, and it is questionable to what degree any boycott is going to hurt it. The left has tried similar boycotts to no avail with Chick-fil-A. May the boycott also fail with Home Depot. And we are grateful for the integrity of Mr. Marcus. This week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, oddly and strangely, supermodel, British-born Naomi Campbell came to New York and prayed at the grave of the former Lubavitch rabbi Menachem Schneerson, whom many in the Hasidic Lubavitch movement, known as Chabad, believed was the Messiah. And as he had no dynastic heir, will raise from the dead. That is, a Jewish Messiah who had to come and die and raise from the dead. This has created divisions within the Hasidic movement with other Hasidic sects because of its resemblance to Christianity and the beliefs of Jewish Christians, Messianic Jews, that Jesus, Yeshua, was the Messiah who came and died and rose from the dead. The notion that a Messiah would come and die and raise from the dead was something that was dismissed in rabbinic argumentation against the messiahship of Jesus. But they can no longer say that or do that, in that the fastest growing Hasidic movement has been Lubavitch, Chabad, with Menachem Schneerson's followers saying he will do just that. To have seen this supermodel, who was not of any Jewish background, she is of African descent or Afro-Caribbean descent, but British, praying at his grave in Queens was quite a sight. She was not the only celebrity to do so. He had a universalist view that said there was good in all people, and by doing mitzvot, one good deed at a time, people could change the world of all faiths. He appeals very much to people caught up in New Age philosophy because of Kabbalah and mysticism. He appeals to people of various backgrounds, but ironically, he is a divisive figure within Judaism. But it's taking place this week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, in the congressional district in Minnesota, in a community known as St. Louis Park, there was a protest against the local council who banned the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. This is the congressional district of Ilan Omar, the Somali-born Muslim who many would see as certainly anti-American and who appears in the opinion of many people to have immigrated to the United States taking an oath of loyalty to the Constitution that was disingenuous, meaning she should be denationalized and deported back to Somalia. Some of her statements in favorable of radical expressions of Islam persuade some people she should be not only denationalized, but put in a cage in Guantanamo. Various people have various views, but it is her left-wing district that elected this woman, who remains silent about the women's rights abuses in the Islamic world, yet is supported by the American left and a highly left-wing community. A council meeting was stormed by patriotic members of the district and that community in St. Louis Park who protested the actions of the council, who appeared in the national media to be detached and elitist. And it took place this week in prophecy. This testifies to the growing division within American society that is taking place on nearly every front. Finally, this week in prophecy, we have another one of our editorials from our staff editorialist, Reuben Rothler. A Revelation chapter 13, verse 17 scenario in the making, ? Are cryptocurrencies, artificial intelligence, consumer monitoring, the Orwellian cyber world already a functional reality in China, and the censored, invented, and spun news as privately presented on social media, setting the stage for a Revelation chapter 13, verse 17 scenario? That is, an environment where no one can buy or sell. Now, Mr. Rothler raises a very viable question. In China, now you have social credit monitoring, where someone's behavior and political disposition determine their credit worthiness, not simply their income and financial position. Be that as it may, Reuben Rothler writes, both China and the West constrain the flow of information. In China, freedom of speech is blatantly suppressed with criminal penalties, media censorship, and surveillance. In the West, a comparable outcome is achieved through more subtle nuanced means. Here in the West, the parameters of what is presented as the sensible gamut of political discussion are curbed by mainstream corporate media outlets. Then an elaborate song and dance are paraded during periodic election cycles, pitting candidates who are bought and controlled often by business interests in order to give the middle class a false sense of control over decision-making and to keep them passively entertained. Big tech's algorithms have enhanced this agenda by filtering what we, the public, are supposed to through our news feeds on social media. What's more, a course of selective silencing has been enacted recently by Facebook and Twitter to censor some of the more controversial conservative commentators, such as Milo Yiannopoulos and Alex Jones, while corresponding figures on the left haven't received this treatment. Such actions advance these corporations as arbitrators of truth over what is protected speech under the First Amendment. It has been argued that this puts them at odds with their purpose status as a neutral platform and as de facto content curators, that they would be better defined as publishers with all the liability of this that it would entail. Naturally, these behemoth corporations want to have their cake and eat it too, and so fight tooth and nail through lobbying efforts to avoid being designated as publishers. To this end, the critics of their biased policies correctly cite a de facto agenda to not only influence, but to maintain a degree of control, if possible, the outcome of presidential elections. The sheer breadth and scale of surveillance in modern China are distressing to fathom, as elsewhere it wasn't rolled out overnight, just as 9/11 was used as justification for fast-tracking the Patriot Act through Congress, which had such provisions as warrantless wiretapping. China exploited the alleged threat posed by its Muslim minority community, the Uyghurs, in the western China provinces to initiate the technique and apparatus of mass surveillance that has been expanded nationwide. Governments have never missed out on this manipulating such as an opportunity. A terrorist rogue menace, real or fabricated, is viewed as a pretext for clamping down on dissent and further controlling the populace in general, and of course with this the curtailment of rights. In China, this has materialized as over 200 million cameras, operating artificial intelligence to monitor behavior, read body language, scan faces, and track movement. Appealing to the idea of improving traditional Confucian ethical values, the authorities have even pedantically deployed this system in order to detract perpetrators of minor infractions, such as jaywalkers, who are then publicly shamed by having their faces and personal details plastered on large screens in real time. Moreover, in China, every citizen is issued with a rating that denotes their social credit score. Obviously, the West has had credit checks for decades, which impacts the terms of obtaining a loan. But this system is far more expensive. The social credit score also takes into account political activism and whether an individual is perceived to be a threat to the Communist Party. Consequences of a poor score can include travel restrictions. Irrespective of where they live and are lured by technology's convenience, which has elicited increasing encroachments of our privacy, we have sleepwalked into a dystopian future that has become modern life. The crux of the problem lies in the fact that our data is considered to be free and abundant. Natural resources for corporations to monetize. The business model has been termed surveillance capitalism. Current developments are far more disturbing than what was predicted by Orwell and Huxley. Google and Facebook know better, and we now know ourselves and can predict our behavior with a high degree of accuracy. They want to go one step further and actually change our behavior. A profusion of tailor-focused, individualized marketing has sprung up around this technology. However creepy and disconcerting such ads are, more horrifying is Facebook's plan to enter the financial markets with the launch of new cryptocurrencies, especially such as Libra. Unlike Bitcoin, which uses the same blockchain technology that stagnated, Libra has the backing of major financial institutions such as MasterCard, and so avoids the delegitimization of operating in obscurity. The merging of far-reaching data collection on individual consumer behavior with circulating currency would eventually hand Facebook control of financial transactions themselves. The corporation could prevent individuals from buying and selling. Should conventional banking be rendered obsolete, as have been predicted by some leading figures in the world of finance, such corporations would in effect direct all their personal pecuniary activities, while simultaneously knowing everything about us. Neither Nero or Napoleon, Mao or Hitler could have imagined in their wildest dreams such an immense monopoly over people's lives. Yet this nightmarish scenario may be just around the corner. Mr. Rothler's editorial is not alarmist. It's simply factual and realistic. While we can focus on human rights abuses in China and on social credit scoring, we remain oblivious to the activities of Silicon Valley and Seattle and high-tech industries controlling communication and social media. They can influence elections. They can editorialize news. They can censor information being put into the public. And they can do so without any regulation. It is the view of some people on both the right and the left, as well as some libertarians, that internet must be treated as a public utility, as the airwaves belong to the public, not the broadcasters. They should be subject to regulation based on preserving and defending constitutional principles. They, of course, do not want this. They have the money for lobbyists and lawyers, but this is the reality we face. It is not only China threatening personal, political, economic, and what will undoubtedly be ultimately religious freedom. It is Western corporations, most of them based on the West Coast, of the United States. Mr. Rothler argues that they should be treated as publishers with the same liabilities. I would not disagree with him. My personal view is internet was developed largely at the expense of the taxpayer, in large measure by the Pentagon to have multiple command and control centers. There should be legislation establishing internet as a public property. The cyber world should be as much public property as walking on the street. It does not belong to these industries. These industries must play by the same rules of liability and guaranteeing the rights of other people. Can you imagine if someone said, you're not allowed to drive on my street because I said so? Well, if you bought enough property and paved your own street, you can say that. But to go out and say, you cannot come on my street where I live because I said so, this would be unacceptable. But that is exactly what is happening in the cyber world. We know where this is going. With the development of cryptocurrencies and the capacity to control people and to profile them and to give them credit ratings based on their politics, their religion, their social behavior. What's already happening in China and being more facilitated in its possibilities by artificial intelligence. This is the world that's coming. It is easy to see that it is heading to the book of Revelation, chapter 13. And we're heading there quickly. What is alarming is that how many people, and particularly how many Christians, are ignoring these realities. We recently did a video on Moriel TV concerning 7 trends that indicate the return of Jesus may be coming sooner than most of us think. We would indeed urge you to watch it if you haven't done so already. Reuben Rothler is correct in what he says. Thank you so much for listening. We continue to urge prayers for Israel, Shalom Shalom Yerushalayim, for Mr. Netanyahu, certainly for Mr. Trump and his administration in the United States, and we urge prayers for the outcome of the political fate of Great Britain. Thank you so much for listening. God bless. My name is Jacob Prasch. Shalom v'lehitraot.